go to our second speaker of today, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to Stefan Bird-Pollan. Stefan Bird-Pollan is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Kentucky in the US. His interests include Kant, Hegel, and the German tradition in aesthetics, from Kant to Adorno. Also critical theory and psychoanalysis. And among his several publications, I will mention two here. He has a book on Hegel, Freud, and Fanon, The Dialectic of Emancipation, published in 2014. And I'll mention also a paper, also relevant to our main topic of the conference, The Place of the Unconscious in Systematic Critiques of Prejudice, Lessons from McKinnon in Critical Race Theory, published in the Philosophical Forum in 2020. So it's a pleasure to have you here among us, Stefan, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Oh, are you unmuted? You have to mute yourself, I think. And
okay, so
it should.
I have to speak very loudly so that people can hear me. Is that working online?
It shouldn't be the case.
Okay. Well, I'll speak in a very projection way then. Okay. So yeah. So thanks to the organizers. I'm really delighted to be back in Leuven, and yeah, it's been a really great conference, and I'm really glad to be part of it. So I'll jump right in. I just wanted to say I will actually be talking more extensively about Charles Mills, and so I think Lyra's paper would have been is a nice compliment, and we sort of fit well together in this. Also coming from the U.S. context, I guess. Mills is someone that we have to we're thinking through over in the States. So I'll just jump right in here. Okay. The reckoning with individualist liberalism, which began with Hegel's critique of the French Revolution and found prominent expression in the thought of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, formed the basis of both the critiques of feminists and critical race theorists in the post-war era. Feminists in critical race theory made use of some of the tools offered by earlier thinkers in order to challenge the misogyny and racism which co-constituted liberalism. While some theorists sought a total break with liberalism, others sought to appropriate the tools of liberalism in order to criticize and improve it. Yet what in the thought of previous thinkers is to be appropriated and what is to be rejected remains contested. The relation between Hegel and Marxism remains a paradigmatic example. Kant's legacy looms even larger in particular in its more obvious association with liberalism through the concepts of autonomy and individual freedom. Few today deny the importance of some sort of idea of autonomy, yet most recognize the historical example of autonomy Kant had before him was the restrictive version, which seems to have only held for white property-owning males. So what remains contested is the relation between the historical and the philosophical version which seems to coexist in Kant. Let me go one step further and suggest that the idea of Kant itself is contested. Who is this Kant who held conflicting views? Was he, qua individual, subject to the forces of bourgeois thought, trying to reconcile an alienated world with the idea of human freedom and Adorno thinks? Was he rather a colorblind racist whose thinking must be rejected and has been argued by Emmanuel and Charles Mills? And what are we rejecting in rejection? Is it the thinking of one philosopher only, or the one who's not so different from many others? Is it the thinking or Kant as representative of a tradition? And if it is the latter, since we're not rejecting the whole tradition, Charles Mills considers himself a radical black liberal. What exactly are we rejecting in this tradition? The principles of autonomy and equality? Kant's particular formulation of these principles? Which formulations, the one in the lectures on anthropology and the lectures on geography, or the ones in the critique of practical reason? And what is the criterion or set of criteria which would allow us to tell what is living and what is dead in Kant? Who or whatever Kant turned out to be? No single paper can untangle this still ongoing debate, but I would like to suggest that it is by attending to the imminent virtues of Kant's philosophy, that the immediate dangers to be of Kant's philosophy can be recognized and rejected. This means, as Marx did with Kant, with Hegel, recognizing that the fundamental impetus of Kant's philosophy is that of critique, and that these critical elements are at times something that Kant falls short of in his own writing. The paper falls into two parts. In the first, I articulate what I see as the fundamental critical insight in Kant's philosophy and show how this critical insight can be used to reject Kant's own racist views. I do this by showing that the critique leveled by Kant by Eze and Mills depends on an unarticulated conception of critique developed in its most trenchant form by Kant himself. The second part of the paper takes up Kant's critical paradigm and shows that it could be applied to the fantasy conception of the racial order, which is central to the writings of Fanon, Eze, Mills, and Mendes. Although I have to say I will not get to the second part. That's make it for the publication. So I'll just present the imminent critique of Kant and then its sort of imminent refusal by Kant. So we'll see. Okay. Kant, critical and less critical. In this first part of the paper, I propose to do three things. First, to sketch what I understand as Kant's critical project in general. Second, to accept and Mill's critiques of Kant's racism by acknowledging the way in which Kant's racism fails to be critical by Kant's own standard. And finally, suggest that the critique of Kant mounted by Eze and Mill is itself best understood as an expression of Kant's own critical epistemology. So let me start with the first point. The project Kant announces in the B preface, the second preface he wrote for the critique of pure reason, announces a conflict between philosophy, that is metaphysics, and science, which Kant claims his critical philosophy can resolve. On the one hand, there is a philosophical tradition of rationalism, which claims to know nature a priori. On the other hand, there is the activity of science, which through observation and experimentation grasps different elements of nature. While rationalism is intellectually overpowered, it is empirically underpowered, which means that its thinking makes it impossible to integrate observations into the philosophical systems in anything but a distorted way. Science, on the other hand, has no way of connecting its different empirical insights because it lacks a structure for doing so. The solution to this problem is Kant's transcendental philosophy, which, because it is transcendental and not transcendent, is able to put the empirical and the structural in relation in a non-question-based way. It does so by recognizing that empirical observations occur against the background of more basic concepts which must be in operation for thinking to take place at all. Yet Kant also recognizes that the sorts of concepts we employ in understanding nature must be sensitive at the empirical level. This creates a self-revising relation between empirical observation and thinking, which has its deepest expressions in the conception of the subject as both receptive to nature and spontaneously able to organize nature. Yet this relatedness of receptivity and spontaneity and nature and mind is itself ungrounded, which is to say that it is perpetually self-grounded. At its deepest level, Kant's project concerns the condition for the possibility of knowledge, not knowledge itself. Any knowledge we can gain is to be understood as an application of our fundamental possibility of knowledge. Kant's project must thus be conceived as a theory about the possibility and legitimacy of constructing theories about nature, and concerns itself with the principles necessary for this. Of course, Kant also ventures into the construction of theories about how nature is, but it is important to realize that these areas of his investigations are themselves only applications of the basic sort of a priori conditions of the possibility of knowledge that he's articulated as his fundamental project in the first critique. So now I'd like to proceed to some of the critiques of Emmanuel Eze and Charles Mills of Kant, and then move on here. No one contests that Kant held racist views. What is contested is what to make of these views. In this section, I'd like to take up two positions, which will help us to make clear what exactly is the status of these races. Let me also state clearly that Kant has a theory of the racial division of humanity, which makes his claim more than mere observation. Okay, so that's an important point to acknowledge. It's a theory, but it's supposed to be a systematic structure. What ultimately concerns us here is not the content of the theory of the races, but how this theory is to be understood as part of the larger theory of the critical project. Still, it will be useful to summarize Eze's account of Kant's theory of race briefly. Eze argues that for Kant, race constitutes a transcendental category of analysis. The argument rests on the central place of the ego in Kant's anthropology, which Eze argues is closely linked to categories of character. Because character for Kant operates as a category of racial division, Eze concludes that race is a transcendental category in Kant. Eze also argues that in Kant, the categories of beauty and the critique of judgment are racialized. Ultimately, however, the strategy for claiming that Kant's philosophy of race is transcendental depends on claiming that his theory of race is explanatorily prior to the critical works. The critiques are, you might say, subplots in this grand, admittedly sometimes blurry vision of transcendental philosophy, says Eze. The main plot being the theory of race. If this is a difficult line to hold, if one wants to claim that one is interpreting Kant's thought as a whole, as Eze is doing when he seeks to assimilate the term transcendental into Kant's theory of race. Yet, as we saw, the transcendental is not just a term of art in Kant's philosophy. It is a substantive philosophical position concerning not knowledge, but the possibility of knowledge. This makes of the transcendental elements of Kant's philosophy the ground for knowledge, not knowledge itself. So while it may be argued that the concepts of race function as organizing concepts for Kant's taxonomy of different people, these concepts remain connected only to one very problematic corner of Kant's own application of this theory to the possibility of knowledge. As Brandt points out, Kant nowhere specifies the scientific character of the lecturers, excluding them from scientific knowledge, which can be had in the Kantian sense of knowledge, which requires nature's mathematization. Lectures on anthropology and physical geography, rather, engage in a taxonomy in which Kant concerns himself only with illuminating observations, but not with presenting a systematic treatment of the subject that is systematic in a transcendental sense. So the claim that race for Kant constitutes the transcendental is to reverse the grounding relation, to make the application of the theory into the theory itself. Well, this is no doubt possible. It is no doubt possible to reverse this order by employing, for instance, the deconstructive strategy. This is not the stated interpretive aim of Eze, who does not wish to jettison the universal in favor of a post-structuralist aphoretic reading. Moving on to Charles Mills now. Mills acknowledges that Eze's argument may have been too ambitious and focuses his critique on the implications of Kant's racism for moral and political philosophy. While Eze's argument has a clear target in Kant, Mills' position remains difficult to pin down. Yet the stakes couldn't be higher. Quote, if my analysis is correct, writes Mills, then we certainly should throw out Kant's moral philosophy, since Kant's moral philosophy makes whiteness and maleness prerequisite for full personhood. Okay, so just to be clear, Mills says he wants to throw out Kant if Kant turns out to be racist. Mill's Kant remains elusive, however. On the one hand, Mill wants to see Kant as a representative of liberalism per se. The passage is worth quoting in full. Quote, in bringing together the moral theorists of the modern period, most famous for his putatively uncompromising commitment for the infrangibility of our duty to respect persons, and the term subperson infamously associated with the Nazi movement, I am seeking to demonstrate the racialization of this foundational concept of liberalism, and thus to challenge how we think about modern Western moral and political philosophy. End quote, says Mill. Right? The implications are sweeping and amplified by arguments Mill has already made in his earlier The Racial Contract, where Kant figures on Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau as a representative of the Enlightenment tradition. Reading Kant as a representative of liberalism means for Mill rejecting the strategy of reading Kant's work selectively, taking what is philosophically useful and rejecting the rest. We simply cannot sanitize Kant, writes Mill. Quote, there is something deeply troubling and profoundly misleading about racially sanitizing Kant's views and then representing them as if they were the views of the pre-sanitized Kant. Who and what makes the cut in a moral theory is certainly central to what kind of theory it is, end quote. This position brings with it a number of problems, hermeneutically and otherwise, in the sense that it most flagrantly contradicts Mill's account of Black radical liberalism, which includes Kant as one of its three main pillars. Again, Mills, Kant is crucial, obviously, a Kant purge of racism I earlier discussed in chapter 6 of this from the previous quote was taken, as the most important theorist of the dominant variety of contemporary liberalism, which is deontological. So here there's, I guess, what I'm seeing is a glaring contradiction inside of Mills, thinking about Kant and his project of decolonizing Kant, of calling Kant to a reckoning. And I think it's not. So I'm using Mill here. Mill's as an example. I think he's not the only one to struggle with this, and so therefore I'd like to sort of see what we can make of this tendency, which perhaps many of us share, both this kind of horror at what Kant wrote and also a sort of commitment to the fundamental idea. Okay, there are at least 2 points worth making. The first concerns Mill's claim that Kant is a representative of liberalism and that his work cannot be sanitized at his racist views. The other concerns the use one can make of Kant's views against racism. Okay, so I'll first deal with the first step. The reasons for the first position seem to me twofold. On the one hand, there is the épaté les bourgeois dimension, which reaches its apogee when Mill compares Kant directly to Hitler. Mill says, I am not comparing Kant to Hitler, end quote. For this strategy to work most effectively, Kant's racism must be linked closely to liberalism itself. We can take this point to be part of the intellectual sociology Mills is pursuing in The Racial Contract, where he makes the claim that mainstream political philosophy in the analytic tradition at least systematically ignores racism. This fact needs to be brought home by taking down Kant, who is central to the tradition. Here, Kant's theory of race, which we can now see as racist, stands in for the Rawlsian theory of the social contract, which we cannot yet see is racist for Mills. The point against modern liberalism seems to be that Kant's racism is quite compatible with Kant's liberalism, and that liberalism is thus not only compatible, but in fact historically complicit in racism. Mills formulates these points as follows. Contemporary social contract theory, when it's tempted to add, at least I am, recognition theory to this list, operates according to a conception of human relations which ignores Europe's and later the United States history of colonialism, racism, and misogyny. The sidelining of this history amounts to racism because it's the expression of another political system to be theorized, namely the theory of how white people have oppressed non-white people through colonialism and later systematic racism. Mills calls the second political system the racial contract. White political philosophers, white political philosophy, which abstracts from race, is an expression of this deeper political system. Sanitization of Kant's philosophy would then be to sweep under the rug the history of oppression of which Kant's theory of race is part. This point makes of Kant's theory of race the unacknowledged twin of liberalism. Kant thus becomes a perspective from which to target contemporary white liberals, whether they wish to defend Kant or charge Kant with to defend Kant or not. It is important to note that unlike Eze, Mills offers no independent argument for why we should consider Kant's work as a whole racist. Mills has rather concentrated his efforts on the debate whether Kant is one of the inventors of the modern concept of race and about the status of Kant's theory of race as it relates to the status of a person. And he has, to my knowledge, made no attempt to claim that the abstract idea of autonomy based into liberalism is in itself racist. The main current of his argument rather goes towards criticizing Kant for not seeing white people as autonomous, as he obviously should have. Okay, so now I'm going to address the second point I made and use using Kant for good. How can we do this? In this section, I want to explore Mill's second claim, namely that Kant can be used for good if appropriately sanitized. Mills acknowledges that, quote, in the case of race, even if it were true that non-whites counted as subpersons for Kant, by virtue of their inferior rationality and diminished capacity for autonomy, deracializing the theory would just require getting rid of a false factual claim, not modifying the basic moral principles. While Mills, perhaps because of his untimely death in 2021, does not say how it would go about sanitizing Kant, he does suggest a strategy for distinguishing between the claims of the social contract and the racial contract, using the distinction between abstraction and idealization, following Honora O'Neill's classic essay, Abstraction, Idealization, and Ideology and Ethics, which was written in the defense of Kant's position. Mills argues that we can distinguish between the sort of idealization of moral agents occurring under liberalism and the factual existence of humans in their oppressed states. So now it actually, for time reasons, I'm going to skip the official reason, the official analysis that Mills gives, and I'm going to go back to actual Kantian, not just a Kantian analysis of how we could sanitize Kant, but actually use Kant to figure out how to talk about race. That seems to me a more interesting project that maybe more worthy of our time here. So, Kant's theory of cognition. Okay, let's examine Kant's theory of cognition from the perspective Mills suggests is central to racism. That one concept we have of a certain group of people prevents us from seeing them under other descriptions of concepts. We can follow Mills in suggesting that this is ideological, that is a certain reification of the cognitive process. In order to overcome this ideological reification, we must achieve a cognitive structure in which concepts and perceptions, intuitions, cooperate. That is, we must once again, or perhaps for the first time, allow concepts to be influenced by perceptions and perceptions to be guided by concepts. To put this in traditional language in philosophy, we must eschew rationalism, which privileges concept over perception, and hence precisely the ideological condition of diagnosis, but also eschewing empiricism, which holds that concepts play only a secondary role in knowledge production. We have already seen Kant's project takes as basic a cooperation between spontaneity and receptivity, mind and nature, and that Kant also argues that this cooperation means also a mutual critique of each side by the other. Let me sketch this theory of cognition with these 2 points in mind in order to show that Kant thinks how Kant thinks cognition must be understood as continually self-revising in a way that is attractive for breaking up the reification of the cognitive processes which occur in races. The cooperation between spontaneity and of mind and our receptivity to nature means for Kant that our cognitive processes are both free in the sense of being up to us, we have to judge, and dependent on the deliverances of nature. Kant differs from his empiricist colleagues, however, in insisting that the given, which is perceived, does not come with its own set of rules attached. Rules or concept constances, siding with the rationalists, are supplied by mind. The world has to be interpreted according to the conceptual way, the concepts we have. This, of course, is precisely what makes room for the possibility of race. Socially produced concepts are uncritically employed to judge other humans. Against this claim, Kant holds out the insight of empiricism that nature exerts a powerful determination on us. We are receptive to nature, and thus receptivity must be allowed to influence the way concepts are applied to it. So we can say that the perception, what Kant calls intuitions, arrive in such a way that we must take notice of them, prompting us to subsume them under concepts. We may do so quickly, ignoring the particulars of the intuition, or we may do so carefully, attending to them in detail. The first is a potentially prejudicial mindset. The second is what Kant calls the scientific mindset. Of course, concepts are not applied to intuitions in a vacuum. They are connected to the network of concepts which we habitually deploy in making sense of the world. This habitual network of concepts blunts us to the new, the different. It need not if we attend to the particular intuition as we often are capable of doing. Nevertheless, our social condition is such that we are enmeshed in a social system of belief which holds all the sorts of conceptions which Mills and others have argued constitute the basis for racism and colonialism. But when I use the philosophers we, as do Mill and they also, I speak too hastily, for this precisely Kant's point that though we, as Heidegger's man, might be beholden to a habitual conceptual network, I am not so beholden. In fact, precisely in the virtue of the conceptual scheme just described, I am always, in principle, capable of discerning what is new in particular in the world, because the world exerts a pull on me, which I cannot just subsume under the socially handed down conceptual scheme. Right? So, I mean, as Adorno would say, right, there's we, which is the social structure, and then there's the I, which is always looking beyond the social determination of the conceptual scheme. My freedom in epistemic matters is precisely my spontaneity consists precisely not being subject to the associated inherited conceptual scheme, but in altering it in accordance with what I perceive nature to be like, in fact, right, through particular experience. And if nature does not provide its own rules, what do I tend to? For Kant, what I tend to is the way in which nature does not fit under the concepts I inherit in order to employ them. Right? Thus, Copernicus, as Kant says in his famous example, noticed that the orbit of the planet in relation to the Earth could not be explained if the Earth was conceived as the center of the universe. When we make the sun center, however, the orbit of the planets could be explained. This means that even within the conceptual realm, nature exerts a force which must nevertheless be interpreted and which resists false conceptualization. But by the same logic, this means that no conception can ever claim for itself certainty, since any concept is liable to be reconceived in light of a different thinking of nature. Thus, Kant provides us with a model of a continually self-revising conceptual scheme. The force which drives this continual reconceptualization is nature itself, our exposure to the different and to the particular. Noting this point brings us back to Kant's opening distinction between cognition and metaphysics, in which Kant claims that it was only by attending to experience that science could make progress. Metaphysics, by contrast, having left experience behind, was left groping in the dark. Kant is under no illusion that this is a difficult task, but it is possible for philosophy to perform this task and for us as individuals to do so as well. Okay, so sort of by way of preliminary conclusion, at least, I want to say, I started with the question of what it means to say that Kant is a racist. We've now traveled through a number of possibilities that Kant, the man, was a racist, that elements of his philosophy are racist, that Kant's entire philosophy is racist, that Kant is a representative of a liberalism, which is fundamentally racist. I have, of course, not disentangled all of these questions or provided answers for them. But I mean, I guess one of the things I just want to say is that Kant is a part of a larger tradition that we need to that holds all of these strands. And I think if we can make progress by acknowledging that there's leeway for ourselves to be in this tradition as well, and to take, I mean, we have a paper by Luis yesterday, but we can take from your ideas. I think we can sort of the authority of experience, well, taking from Kant. The authority of experience authorizes us to engage with what we want in Kant, right? Or in any philosopher itself, right? If the problem speaks to us, if the text speaks to us because of the problems we have, then we can go to Kant and do that. And so I think we have the problem of racism and colonialism. And so because we have that problem, we should seek sort of any available means to theorize in that and thinking about that. And I think that Mills saw that in Kant, and I think that Kant, in a way, himself saw that, except that he was then restricted by other commitments that he had engaged in. in which he should have jettisoned. But I suppose in that way, he's probably no different than the rest of us who also hold commitments that are perhaps incompatible with other commitments we hold. So I'll leave it there for another discussion. Right.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for this very stimulating paper. And so questions online here. So online, raise your hands via Zoom, and here raise your physical hands. And we have a question from Elvira.
Thank you so much for the fabulous talk. It was really, really great to hear it. I want to invite you to say a little bit more about how you take up Charles's engagement with Honora O'Neill, in particular in the sense of sort of what is the role of something like Kantian ideals in his positive critique of sort of what makes up a theory of racial justice. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. So that's the part I skipped. So I think that Mills is well. So what he says is that there's this person distinction between abstraction, which all philosophy has to do. All philosophy has to abstract from the particular, otherwise there will be no thinking. Right? Thinking is abstracting. So that's a reasonable move. Now the problem is idealization, right? And in idealization, what you do is you take what is abstracted and you reify it effectively, right? You say that it has essential features which then turn out not to have anything to do with the particular thing that you've been abstracting from. And so that's how you get the idea of homo economicus, for instance, right? Rational man. I mean, yes, so humans have reason, but that is not all they have, right? And if you take, so idealization would be to say, to turn this into a theory of rational man. I like that theory. I think it's an important part. But the reason I wrote sort of the second half of the paper is because I just think it's philosophically underpowered. It's not very, it's correct. It's insightful to a certain extent, but we can say much more. And so I think Kant's epistemology, Kant's theory of cognition actually gives us a sophisticated way, a quasi-Hegelian way, in my view, of moving from the particular to the concept. And Kant tells a much better story about this than I think was available in O'Neill's paper, which is not pretending to give a theory of cognition. But I think why not look at the more powerful tools Kant himself offers? And so that's why I sort of skipped ahead to Kant.
Okay, nice. Hi.
Yes, thanks, Stefan, for your paper. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your view that epistemology can be used in a positive way, because to be honest, I was not fully convinced. Also because I think that for Kant, spontaneity and receptivity are not symmetrical. So it's the understanding that subjects nature to its laws, and whatever doesn't conform doesn't count as a potential object of cognition. So we have an important asymmetry there, in my view. But then secondly, I suppose that that other philosophers provide much more fruitful resources to think about the issues that you were addressing. And you mentioned Adorno as a kind of aside. And I know, of course, that you want to recuperate something from Kant because of Mills and the discussion. But why would it be really worthwhile to turn to Kant? So maybe I missed something in your talk. Yes, but
yeah, well, okay. So yeah, that's a good question, and I do have an answer. I didn't put it in the paper because I didn't have time to explicate my view of the theory of cognition. So I didn't really say very much about cognition. So what I take to be basic in Kant's theory of cognition is that for the first time, I think, I mean, if you just start from schematism, right? Then you have the image, and you have the concept. And Kant acknowledges their heterogeneity. And so that the image is taken up by the imagination, and the imagination is the first, it constructs the intuition out of the given, and then the understanding subsumes the intuition under concepts. But you always have the possibility, and I think you just think about this in real life, you always have the possibility to think back to the constellation of the imagination and to revise the concept based on a rethinking of the intuition constellation, right? So that's what I see to be dialectical in Kant, and that's what I'm taking. That's what I think Kant provides, and Kant is the source of that kind of thinking, which is of course a central thought in some sense in Hegel. It's a central thought in Adorno. And I don't want to go into the whole epistemological questions. Let me address the second question: why Kant? And I think it's important for us to address this question at Kant, and rather than to go to a philosopher who is, I think, maybe just as good, but indebted to Kant, but less known, which is Adorno. And I think, if we think about this as already being available in Kant, whom everyone has had some contact with, that's a more fruitful way, in some sense, to popularize this and to see. You don't have to go all the way to the critical theory. You can see this kind of anti-racist epistemology is already available in Kant, and I think you just reach more people that way. So I think there's also sort of pedagogical, popularizing aspect to that.
Yes, thanks.
So regarding the contradiction that you described in this earlier work on Kant, I was wondering if it doesn't help us to just keep in mind that kind of work, also Edith's work, was created in the context of landscape and Kant scholarship, when people generally were in denial about these topics, right? So when I was a student, no one talked about the great, these rights and these topics more closely. But I think the kind of formulations and rhetoric that people like Easy and Mills in that time, these shoes, that's also motivated by the perception that generally there is simply this tendency to deny those things, or to say, yeah, it's just some empirical details, and we can maybe forget about them. And so the proposal to say we have to look more closely at possible systematic connections here, that seems perhaps understandable. And then so I was wondering how you see that kind of work in that context, and then also whether or not this somewhat more optimistic take on the issue in respect to Kantianism really solves the contradiction, because there he still insists that there's a great footnote where he discusses that the reviewer and also talks about these precisely these problems. She insists that there are, that it's not simply a systematic shows us one interesting possibility for progress.
Yeah, I agree. I think that so the question was about about Mill's position and what the context was for the online people. I think it's true, right? So of course the debate that much of this comes out of was a debate from the 90s and the early 2000s. Mill's papers from white rights, black wrongs are much more recent. That's not really so much the point. I mean, the point is, I think that Mill's it presents us with a sort of antinomy, and I think that his own solution to the antinomy, through this theory of abstraction, is an insufficiently sort of philosophically substantive response. And so that's why I wanted to, I didn't want to substitute Hegel for that or Adorno. I wanted to substitute Kant. I wanted to say the answer, Mills, is to go even deeper into Kant, and you saw that, and that's why I want to acknowledge that, he died unexpectedly and early, and so he may well have had this in mind. I kind of claim to be completing his project, But I just think that there's just a lot of resources, especially in Kant's theory of cognition, to address just this kind of problems, which is to say that racism is the reification of our conceptual scheme. And Kant gives us an account of the ways in which we continually revise our conceptual scheme. This is really important. And he does so in a way that is maybe easier to stomach. I mean, I'm saying Hegelian, so not for me a problem, but it's easier to stomach than going all the way to absolute idealism, which is not for everyone. Right? So.
Wait, because people couldn't hear Fran's question very well. So maybe if you could come closer, or we bring the computer there. No, yeah, if you can come to this computer, maybe. Okay, yeah, okay, good. Yeah.
You can share my screen. That would be
I'll ask my question.
If people hear well, if we speak here into the microphone, online people. Is okay? Is this okay?
I will start and we can shout it. But I just wonder if you would want to give us slightly stronger arguments against Eze's claim that that race for Kant is a transcendental category. Because you made, I mean, very, very briefly, you just made the argument by Brands that the anthropology for Kant is not scientific, it's not mathematizable. But I would say that it would be an improper science and still a science if it's not mathematizable. And I would personally wonder whether scientificity is the kind of important criterion here. And so maybe instead it would be distinguishing transcendental philosophy from anthropology and other sciences. And yeah, there's a further point which we need to discuss now, but that's the general guess.
Yeah, no, I think I may have gone over that. I did try to say that quickly. I said the critical project, as I understand, is in its course conditions the possibility of science, and then there's the theorization of science. But those are separate, right? And those could be decoupled. I think for Kant, they're part of the same project, and that's really important. But they are one is the condition for the possibility of the other. And so I think if the theory of science turns out not to be quite right, then that doesn't necessarily imply that the conditions for the possibility of science were not shown by Kant. That is a place where Kant differs from Hegel. Right? For Hegel, it's sort of an all or nothing approach in general. And I mean, although the distinctions could be made at first in Hegel too, but in Kant, I think there's a way in which you can sort of peel back different layers of his account. And that's, I mean, I suggest we can peel back the fairly non-scientific from the more scientific, from the transcendental. So like an onion, a little bit of peel out the bad parts, I guess, I'm hoping.
Okay, so please join me in thanking our speaker. Thank you so much, Stefan.